Today, we'd like to unpack this with David, who is the CEO and then co-founder of Finmo, which is the next generation treasury operating system for the real-time payment and also the treasury management. Maybe just to kick this off, David, maybe if you can just start with a bit more of your background. Just talk us through your journeys. You've been having a leadership roles at the compliance, the risk side in the financial services. What did you really see firsthand on some of the pain points, and what really made you start the Finmo to really solve those problems?
No, sure. Thank you, Taka. And good to be here, everyone. I promised Taka that I would only spend 2 minutes with my background. But so I've actually taken a sort of somewhat untraditional sort of path into the commercial lead for Finmo as the CEO. As Taka mentioned, I've actually spent the last 20 years in the sort of risk and compliance and regulatory space. So navigating the waters of, expanding into new markets, tackling the complexities around regulation and so on and so forth. And so my background actually is more in the fintech space, but across sort of those segments. And so I spent, years at PayPal, running their sort of compliance and risk infrastructure through sort of Asia and into sort of more of their regulated markets across the world. And prior to that, sort of with, Ernst & Young on sort of the advisory side, but always commonly coming up with the same types of problems with respect to, money, payments, the movement of those payments, and sort of globalization with respect to kind of how to better, facilitate finance through, global flows. And then stumbled across actually, some of these pain points that we'll talk about today with respect to, the globalization of companies and how they can better and more seamlessly sort of manage their treasury functions globally.
Great. In your journey at the PayPal, EY, and also the Rapid as well, I'm sure you interacted with many CFOs, and also you see the journey of how the role of the CFO has evolved over time. In this CFO summit as well, we've been discussing about the role of the CFO as well. And then I think one theme is really about this role is really becoming more strategic. Maybe if you can share a bit more about this, your view of why the role is more strategic than neighbors. What you really observed based on your interaction with the CFOs in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. No, good question. And our friend from Barclays actually laid the landscape pretty well in terms of all the changes that we're seeing sort of globally. I think from my perspective, being in the sort of risk and compliance function sort of globally, I always used to sort of see the CFOs and treasurers pull their hair out whenever there was an upcoming board meeting or sort of strategic review of the business, etc. And as you can imagine, the likes of PayPal operate sort of around the world, and even getting a handle on sort of Asia, right, in terms of how they're operating in various markets, what sort of currencies they're collecting, etc. I still to this day fall off my chair when I sort of ask a CFO, how are you managing your treasury function? And the answer is often, in Excel spreadsheets that are consolidated together and, manipulating the data to figure out after my coffee in the morning what I need to actually focus on. And I saw that firsthand at the likes of PayPal and big organizations. And I often wondered, and I always reflected back on, even at a personal level, right, the fact that I've got multiple credit cards, multiple bank accounts, multiple loans, unfortunately, and actually trying to consolidate the view from a personal perspective is somewhat complex. I never know where I am from a cash flow perspective, as an example. And so I attribute that to sort of a mid-market sort of customer that has several organizations around the region, the complexities that we just heard about from our Barclays friend around geopolitical sort of pressures, currency risk, FX, etc. And so one of the things that is the reason for founding Finmo is, can we solve that complexity? Can we make it a bit easier for finance functions to actually sort of be more at the forefront and working with sort of leadership to, obtain data in a quicker way, in a more meaningful way, etc. And we'll get into a little bit about how we're solving that.
Great. I think when we say that complexity, right, there are many layers of that kind of complexities. And I think one area of the complexity that many of the CFOs and the teams are facing is about this, the geographical complexities as well. Based in Singapore, many of them are really working in a diverse set of countries which has a different banking regulations, different operating systems. So maybe if you can share a bit more about the complexities with regards to the situation where you need to work with the multiple countries and the multiple markets. What did you really observe on the challenges and the complexities navigating the finance and operations which cut across the multiple markets?
Yeah, again, a good question. I think we all witnessed the sort of run on banks in the US a couple of years ago, et cetera. And I think one of the challenges I always, from a regulatory perspective, was talking to CFOs about, how do you safeguard money? How do you sort of ensure that you've got control over the cash flow and so on and so forth? And again, it's sort of this, schizophrenic, if you like, view of the world, which is actually I need to diversify my portfolio and hold cash in various bank accounts around the world, right? Because I don't want a centralization risk, to where our funds are being held. Then add the complexity of day one global sort of viewpoint, globalization, digitization. CEOs like me will say, why aren't we operating in 5 other markets? And the treasury functions and compliance functions will sort of come to me and say, well, actually there's licensing, there's sort of restricted currencies, there's controls that need to be in place, et cetera. And so I think the simplification that we're sort of working with is around how do you simplify kind of the viewpoint, the aggregated view of your balances, as an example, to do treasury-related functions, whether that be the money movement capability, whether that be the invest, so working through your excess liquidity and working capital to be able to better deploy that in a seamlessly loadable and redeemable way, so that if you do actually have a cash flow crunch at some future point, you can pull that out and sort of do what you need to do in terms of managing that risk. And so lots of sort of areas that I think we're simplifying, but overall, I think it's the globalization, the digitization that's pushing people more and more into more markets, which then adds further complexity to sort of their operations.
Yeah, and I think that makes lots of sense. Maybe just quite curious to ask one question to the audience. How many of you have been managing the finance operations across, let's say, the more than 3 markets? If you can raise a hand on the companies managing. Yeah, no, I think more than half, maybe 60%. Yes, I think that's really the complexity that everyone is managing. Me as a Japanese, I think many of the CFO in Japan might only focus on the market, but I think in Singapore, many of them are by default really managing the multiple markets, and hence the globalization and the complexities that you're working, especially on the previous the sessions, when the macro is really uncertain. I think that's the really more and more challenging role for the CFOs. So I guess these are the complexity many of the CFOs are facing on a day-to-day basis as well. If you can share a bit more about, as a Finmo, how you are really trying to help them solve those challenges. If you can share some examples of, some of the solutions you've been working with to help the CFOs to navigate those challenges. Yeah,
for sure. So if you take the concept of, the sort of mid-market, multiple entity organizations around the region, particularly in this, this area of the world, lots of organizations have, Singapore headquarters, entities in Malaysia and in Thailand, Philippines, et cetera. That in itself creates some complexity, because how do you do things like cash pooling, as an example, in a seamless way? And the reason I pick up that example is most times mid-markets will not work with one bank provider, right? If you go back to the earlier example, I need to certainly diversify my risk by having multiple providers. So what Finmo is trying to do is actually stitch together, the cash management visibility component that then is the central core of what we do downstream with our clients. So what I mean by that is, if you've got 15 different bank accounts around the region, different org structures that need liquidity and cash flow, working capital, what Finmo is doing is actually working with the banks to integrate from a cash management point of view to pull your balances into the Finmo platform. So one of the things that I always fall off my chair about is, I rock up in the morning and I log into 15 different bank accounts, and as I said, download it into Excel, et cetera. So Finmo is trying to solve that complexity. How can I get an aggregated view of the world? Again, the earlier speaker talked about managing FX risk, et cetera. Before you can manage FX risk, you also need to understand sort of where your cash position is globally. And that's half of the problem. So what we're doing is we're taking an approach where we're partnering with the banks and the institutions around the region. And one of the reasons why we chose Asia actually is because there's no concept of open banking here. So if you go to the Europe and US, you can plug in providers. But what I always talk about that lacks that aspect is you can read the data, but you can't necessarily write the data. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to marry those two components, understand and pull the data and look at it from an aggregated cash balance perspective, but actually initiate a payment from one account to the other. And so what we've done is we worked hard at actually acquiring licenses all around the region so that we can actually be in the funds flow and help CFOs and treasurers actually move money within that sort of offering.
I think that's an interesting point. As investors, we also look at this open banking as a spaces. You see that some of the development in the US and in Europe. I think for the Asia, still given the fragmentation of the markets, still we see this is the area some of the evolution is happening at the moment. So I think some of the technology can really help fill the gap to really enable the integration between the core system which companies operate and then the banking side as well. And I think that creating that connectivity is really critical as well. Maybe just, I started this conversation with the increasing trend of this CFO tech. So many companies and the fintechs are really trying to, sort of pain points on the CFO tech side. Maybe if you can share from your vantage point, why do you think this trend is happening? From a CFO point of view, what's the change in their mindset? Why they are more willing to adapt to those technologies? And then how you really see that they are really trying to prepare to modernize the operation system they are working on?
Yeah, no, for sure. I actually just see the CFOs still pulling their hair out because there's no single platform that sort of stitches it together, so to speak. And I'm biased to what we're doing, obviously at Finmo, but I think a lot of the CFOs and treasurers that I talk to, sort of work with siloed sort of providers of multiple partners, multiple FX providers, multiple sort of accounting softwares, ERP, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the challenges, if you want to move fast with that complexity that I talked about, and certainly even from my perspective, right? I have the same expectation of my CFO internally. We work with clients all around the world. And in order to make more decisive, and quicker sort of decisions, et cetera, I think we need access to information and data that allows us to do that. And I think, managing, again, multiple sort of different providers to solve some of these problems in isolation doesn't sort of allow for that. And I think what we're trying to do is actually stitch those components together in order to give better data access, better information that they can use for downstream sort of activity that they do on a day-to-day basis.
Got it. No, great. One of the themes for this summit is the optimal tech integration. And then yesterday, there was also the sessions about the procurement of this new technology as well. Because as a CFO, you also need to think about the ROI of the introducing the new technologies as well. I'm sure that many CFOs are thinking about introducing new technologies, but also you need to consider many other things, about the compliance, the risk, additional costs, change management within the operation side as well. What would you advise or suggest them, when they will consider the introducing new technologies to really modernize their system?
Yeah, again, a good question. I think, the way that we've tried to tackle that is, making it relatively easy to plug bank partners in at its core. And I think that, one of the things that is a challenge for CFOs and treasurers is unplugging a system, plugging another system in, right? All of us have sort of tight roadmaps. We have, different sort of priorities day to day. And so I think it's about actually trying to, stitch together these sort of components so that you can get it from a provider rather than multiple providers. And I think that's the concept that we've tried to take with Finmo, which is let's actually walk a day in the life of treasurers, CFOs. Actually, let's use our own CFO as our main customer. And what do you need to do for, I'm just getting flagged 5 minutes. What do you need to do for liquidity management, FX, et cetera? And I think that's where we've sort of really tried to frame sort of what we can provide for, our clients.
Great. Yeah, and I think stitching together is really the keyword, and really trying to integrate the different systems. And I think that's something what the Finmo is trying to solving for, I think. Now, I think any fireside chat conversations these days, we can always, finish this conversation without talking about the AI. maybe you can talk about some of the new emerging technologies you see in the market as well. With the AI and other technologies, what you think the role of the CFO will change in the next decade? And how do you see this the AI and the other technologies really shaping up the way the CFOs and then their teams operate in this complex the operations?
No, you're right. We can't have a session without talking about AI, that's for sure. And again, our colleagues set the foundation to that. And I don't disagree that, everyone's probably used ChatGPT and all the rest of it and sort of had a play. We see it as a very important sort of component of how we work with our clients. In fact, we've just launched our own, Ask Mo AI capability, as in Mo, Finmo. And really what it's about is, trying to, instead of being reactive, so if you take the picture that I painted before, and I always remember the CFO that I used to work with at PayPal having less and less hair every year, how can he be proactively prompted using the data that is available in an aggregated way to actually focus on what he needs to do after his 9 o'clock coffee? I think that's really what it's about. So how can you leverage in a proactive way in doing that? And what we've developed in Mo is trying to actually achieve that. So not only is it a reactive sort of proposition, which is tell me my highest corridors, understand the different reporting requirements, and have Mo sort of do that based on your aggregated data. But actually, if I'm logging in the morning, I see a world where it's, you've got a cash flow crunch in this currency at this particular point in time. That's what you need to focus on today, as an example. And that's just in the business context. I think there's other aspects of AI that can help, on the employee side, on the compliance and risk side, and there's a whole range of things. But that's how we're thinking about using AI in the Finmo business.
No, great. I think as we also look through some of the startups in the AI spaces, it's really about how to integrate the AI as really the core, the features of the overall system. I think that's something we also see the broader trends as well. So maybe just the last few minutes, I'll take some questions from the audience. I don't know any questions in the Slidos. Or maybe, yeah, this gentleman.
Well, thank you for the sharing. My name is Daniel Chu from HCSA Community Services. So I think as part of modernization, one of the key objectives, right, is to really probably build a top quartile or world-class finance function, right, in this VUCA time. And I think you touched on technology, but people using a technology is really people, right, to a great extent. So how do you think, like, in terms of demand for talent, right, for a CFO to build a world-class function or top quartile function, how should this kind of requirement or demand for talent pivot in the next, say, 3 to 5 years to make sure that the organization maintain or achieve the top quartile finance function?
Yeah, absolutely. No, great question. And, it's funny, as a tech company, my answer is probably biased towards technology, as you say. And I think one of the challenges in keeping up with what's happening in the tech space is to obviously be, having access to the latest tools and the latest innovation and so on and so forth. And so what I would say is, the traditional CFO may have used potentially rudimentary tools, some of the tools that I mentioned already. And I think part of this is about finding people that have, the ability to adapt to new technology and new tools like AI and other capabilities in order to actually, work a bit more smarter, so to speak, in terms of having access to a sort of better database and data set in order to make these decisions on an ongoing basis. So for me, I think it's about actually, even from a regulatory perspective, a business perspective, keeping up with the trends that are happening on the technology side and actually trying to leverage that as part of your day-to-day rather than perhaps, doing it in that more traditional way, sort of as we've seen in the past.
Right. Thank you, Yamada-san and David, for that wonderful session.